Hello, and welcome to another AAIS webinar. I am Linda Jancik, Product Manager of Personal Lines at AAIS. Today we will be discussing hurricane models, creation, usage, and regulation with our associate partner, Davies. Let me start today's discussion by briefly introducing our featured panelists. Greg Fanoe is Director and Consulting Actuary for Davies. Greg has been in the actuarial field since 2005. Thanks for joining us today, Greg.
Happy to be here.
Next, we are also happy to welcome to the panel Sandra Darby, Property and Casualty Division Actuary for the Maine Bureau of Insurance. Sandra reviews all property and casualty rate and rule filings for Maine. Thank you for joining today's panel, Sandra.
Thank you for having me.
And certainly last but not least, we are joined by Shaveta Gupta, Catastrophe Risk and Modeling Advisor for NAIC. Shaveta has over 15 years of experience in the field of catastrophe modeling. Thanks for joining us today, Shaveta.
Thanks for having me, Linda.
We are happy to have each of you talk about today's topic, hurricane models. Today, we will discuss how this data is gathered from inside the storm, why this information is collected, and how it is used by insurance carriers to price policies. Lastly, we will analyze hurricane models from the regulation side, examining how regulators use this data to develop legislation to further protect consumers, as well as maintain a healthy insurance environment. So without delaying any further, let's first dive into the creation part of this discussion. Greg, I would like to kick off today's discussion with you. Can you first talk a little bit about what are CAT models and how they're used and applied in insurance?
Yeah, sure. Before I get too deep into that, I'll just a sentence or two about my background. I come from a diverse background in that I have experience in virtually all aspects of catastrophe models. I have helped catastrophe modelers document and file their models for regulatory review. I have helped regulators review catastrophe models of all types, but hurricane models as well. And I've helped insurance companies and other entities utilize the catastrophe modeling information within their rate plan or any other way they want to use it. So I come from all three backgrounds, so that's the direction I'm coming at it. This is not really a hurricane models one-on-one session, so I'm not going to get into too much depth about the details of how models run and operate. There's lots of resources out there, including many by my co-panelist Shaveta, that provide a lot of details on that. I just want to give a little bit of background information so that we can establish common terminology and common understanding on some of the key issues before we get into the primary meat of the presentation. I'm going to start by sharing this slide with you. This slide does come from Shaveta, so thank you for that. But when we're looking at a hurricane model, we're really looking at the merger of many different areas of expertise. And primarily, we're talking about meteorological expertise, engineering expertise, and insurance expertise. And those are represented in this chart by hazard, which is the meteorological component of the model, vulnerability, which is the engineering component, and exposure, which is the insurance component. Most models will start with the hazard portion of the model. That is projecting out potential hurricanes, determining the frequency with which they'll occur, and the path they'll take if they do occur. So we think this hurricane might form 1 year out of every 100 or 1 year out of every 1,000. A hurricane might form like this. And then we're going to project the path it will take, where it will make landfall, and what will happen once it makes landfall. How much will the wind speed slow down? What path will it take? And this is very similar to the hurricane charts that you see. If you look at the news before a hurricane hits, Hurricane Ian was the most recent one. If you watch the news before that, you'll see lots of charts and graphs that the meteorologists put together that show the projected path of the storm, where it's going to hit, where the eye of the storm is going to be, how big the wind field is going to be. The end result of that is for a hypothetical storm it's produced what they call a wind field. The wind field is an assessment of what areas are being affected by how much wind. So based on where the eye of the storm is, the size of the storm, and how much it slows down once it makes landfall, and what its strength is at landfall, you can say this particular point in space will be impacted by, say, a 110 mile per hour wind. And this point in space will be impacted by an 80 mile per hour wind or 150 mile per hour wind. And so you're able to map out all of the homes and buildings that are impacted by wind and how much wind there is. That feeds directly into the vulnerability component of the model, which is the engineering component. At a very high level, the point of the vulnerability model is to determine if a particular house is hit by a particular wind speed for a particular length of time. This is how much damage it will do to the house. So we're looking at, okay, if this house, the hazard model wind field has projected that this house is going to be hit by a 120 mile per hour wind for 10 minutes. And using our engineering expertise, we're going to determine that the house will be totally destroyed, or there's going to be some damage to the roof, but the rest of the house will be okay. We'll say it's a 10% loss or 25% loss. And that's what the vulnerability component is projecting. So the combination of the hazard and vulnerability component produces an estimate of how much damage is done to every home within the wind field of the model. That's where the exposure component comes in, and we're looking at what homes are written by an insurer, what the limits are on those homes, what the deductibles are on those homes, what the overall limits are, how reinsurance comes into play. And they're using that to project out, here's the loss that a particular insurance company is going to take related to that storm. They'll aggregate that up across various different storms or various different years, however the model works, and that will produce the total catastrophe model estimates for that insurance company. That's a very, very oversimplified take on how models work, but it's a pretty good framework to look at it from. The key thing that's really important about this is that since we're utilizing meteorological and engineering and insurance expertise, there's no one person that can really have the expertise to fully build or regulate or review or use even the results of a hurricane model. You really have to merge together multiple different experts with multiple different expertises and bring them all together in order to do something like that. It's not something that any one person can do on their own. The second thing to point out is that there are a lot of different versions of these models. So there's lots of different ways you can run them. You can run them either with or without storm surge, with or without demand surge, and those have different meanings. You'd have to look to every modeler has different switches and different meanings, different versions of the model. So you really have to get together with the modeler and the regulator to determine what switches make sense for the purpose that you're using it. The main one I do want to highlight is almost every model will have what is called a long-term and short-term version of that model. That is terminology that comes up a lot, but essentially the long-term version, the only difference between the long and short-term versions of the model usually is in the frequency assessment of the hazard model. There can be other differences, but the biggest difference is the estimate of the frequency with which hurricanes are occurring. A long-term model will use long-term, usually 100-year or more averages of the actual landfall rates of hurricanes in the US to project that frequency. A short-term model will be based on shorter-term averages. So that's no surprise based on the name, but the essential gist of it is that a short-term model is based on a projection that due to climate change and other factors, the frequency of landfalling hurricanes has increased in recent times and will continue to increase going forward And the short-term model gives that weight, whereas the long-term model gives that much less weight. All of this is producing a hurricane model output, which will look something like this. These are not real numbers, so don't pay too close attention to them, but they do illustrate the scale and the scope of the numbers we can be talking about in some instances. The two primary outputs of a catastrophe model that insurance companies want is the average annual loss, or AAL, and some estimate of the volatility of the losses. And those could take the form of probable maximum losses, or PMLs, which I've identified in the table. Sometimes they're called tail value at risk, or TVAR. Sometimes they just show the standard deviation, which I have listed in the table here as STD-DEV. Anytime you get CAT model results from a modeler or a company, any terminology you don't understand, it's not always standard, but I think these are pretty standard terminologies, but other modelers may use different terminologies. I'll just very briefly get into what these numbers mean. The average annual loss, or AAL, in this case, $19 million. That is the losses we expect the insurance company to take related to hurricanes on average in any given year over a long period of time. So in all likelihood, what will happen for this company is most years they will have zero losses from hurricanes, and some years they'll have really high losses from hurricanes. And over the course of a long period of time, often we're looking at a 100-year time horizon. In 100 years, we would expect this insurance company to have $1.9 billion of losses at today's dollars and today's exposure. So that's what the average annual loss is projecting. It's not necessarily, in fact, it's really not saying we expect this insurance company is going to have $19 million of loss next year, because it's probably going to be zero. And there's a small chance it's going to be a lot higher than 19, but it's very unlikely it's going to be anywhere close to actually 19 million. You can see the standard deviation, 89 million, is much higher than the average annual loss. That is very common for hurricane exposed companies. And then these PMLs, sometimes people get confused by these, but generally speaking, if we look at the 1 in 100 year PML, which is 412 million, what that means is that 99 years out of 100, we expect this insurance company to have hurricane losses of $412 million or less. And 1 out of every 100 years, we expect this insurance company to have losses of 412 million or more. That is the point at which there's a 1% chance you have more loss than that. And it's the same for everything else. The 1 in 200 PML is a 0.5% chance that the losses will be $580 million or higher. They have different uses in different contexts. In the context of rate making, which is most of what we're talking about today, generally the most important metric is going to be the average annual loss. Within the context of rate making, insurance companies might use this information in an overall rate indication. So for example, you might just load $19 million of expected hurricane losses directly into your indication and add that to the expected non-hurricane losses to produce a total needed premium. That's a pretty common actuarial approach. A lot of times insurance, you can get these numbers, these PML and AAL numbers broken down however you want. You can get them broken down by territory. You can even get them at the policy level if you want. So a lot of times insurance companies will use this information to help inform different rate factors, territory factors, roof age factors, etc. And a lot of times people will use them to help load reinsurance costs into the rate. Other uses of CAT model results include reinsurance purchasing decisions, capitalization decisions. That's decisions about how much reinsurance you want to buy, how much capital your insurance company needs to have, whether you need to go out to market to get more capital. etc. And for those purposes, these PMLs, which show worst case scenarios or very bad case scenarios, are very helpful because you want to say, okay, I want to make sure I have enough reinsurance and capital that a hurricane has only a 0.5, my company next year has only a 0.5 chance of being taken out by a hurricane. Then we'll want to say, okay, well, we'll need to make sure that between our reinsurance and capital, we can cover up to $580 million of hurricane losses because that's the 1 in 200-year return period PML. I think now that I've talked briefly about what CAT models are and how they're typically used, I'll pass it over to Shaveta and Sandra to talk about practically how they're using this and how they're used in the insurance company, why CAT models are important to them and what they're doing. Sandra, first to you, working for the Maine Bureau of Insurance as an actuary, can you give the audience an idea of how you are using these models and why you or other states like you might find them important, even though you're not a Florida, Louisiana level hurricane threat state?
Greg, thank you so much for that detailed overview, and thank you AAIS for inviting me to join this call today. As the Property and Casualty Actuary for the state of Maine, my job is to review all the rate filings that are filed in the state, and part of that is the CAT load that goes into those rate filings to make sure that the companies have built into their rates enough money to cover if there is a hurricane here in Maine. Now, when I started this role about 5 years ago, I had never seen a CAT model, so my experience is nowhere near expert. It's limited in what I've seen so far. So when I began, I saw my first indication with a CAT model in it, and I said, "Oh my gosh, what is this model?" And I asked for more information. They provided me, the information on the CAT model, and I realized that, like Greg said, it's very complicated. You need, engineers, meteorologists, you need lots of expertise in this field. And so what Maine has done is essentially we've requested information on each CAT model in the filings and asked for the version number that they're using for their CAT load. And then we look down to the Florida Commission of Hurricanes to see if they've approved that model. Now, Florida has approved it for use in Florida, then Maine allows it for use in their rate filings. That's because I do not have the expertise to review the CAT model as it is. That being said, we do have, 3,500 miles of coastline here in Maine. And even though our hurricanes are usually a category 1 or a category 2, not as, high severity as the ones that are hitting the coasts of, Florida and Louisiana, we're still concerned with a large coastline about the future. And the reason for them not being so strong in Maine is that when, they track up to Maine, we have a current that comes down from the north that's cold. So the storm loses some of its, fuel because the water is colder here on the coastline. So that kind of keeps the hurricanes from being a higher category. And we have had some historical hurricanes that were, caused a lot of damage. But, sometimes they get downgraded to tropical storms and things. One of the things that I, have learned is, I heard Greg talking about, the switches that are going into the models. And that's one of the places where I feel like as a regulator, I can learn a lot more and become, more educated on, whether they're using demand surge or storm surge and whether that's appropriate for where they have, where their market is in Maine. And so that's one of the things that, we've been working with the NAIC, and they've recently started what's called the Center of Excellence in CAT Risk. And so we've been working to, the Modeling Center of Excellence. And we've been working with the NAIC and Shaveta to learn about the different models, the different inputs for the models. Greg was talking about how you can get it down to the policy level. And so what, carriers do is they use their book of business, their specific book, and they'll run it through the model. And what I want to understand is, if their book is on the coast or if their book is more inland, is, are they pulling the right levers when they're running the model? So that's something that Shaveta and her team at the NAIC, we've been working with them to learn more about. And, and I'm going to hand it over to Shaveta because she has excellent expertise on these CAT models with her 15 years of experience, and let her highlight how we're going to be working with her to learn more about how to review our rate filings.
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you, Greg. Thank you, AAIS, for having me. This is my first panel, so it's a different experience for me. So Sandra and Greg both touched on different points. Like Greg provided an overview of like how these CAT models work, just high level, not going too much in depth. And then Sandra had perspective on like, you know, what as a regulator, what they look at when they see any rate filings from CAT models perspective. So now I would like to pivot the conversation to discuss education around this topic. And then Sandra and I will also highlight some of the regulation around CAT models within different states. So coming back to Sandra's point on that, like, you know, Maine doesn't have a coastline that is much impacted by severe hurricanes, but it is still important for, as a regulator, to learn about these CAT models. So I'm going to first start by providing a little bit background and history on my specific role within NAIC. So within NAIC, I'm part of CAT Modeling Center of Excellence. We simply call it CAT COE in the short form. CAT COE was established last year in July. The recommendation to set up CAT COE came from NAIC's Climate and Resiliency Task Force Technology work stream. And the main rationale behind the recommendation was similar to what Greg said earlier around CAT models, that these models are complex, they are resource intensive, and at the same time, they are a very critical tool that is used by insurance industry to assess and manage CAT risk within their books of businesses as per their risk appetite. And now, if we think from a regulator's perspective, they are also a key stakeholders when it comes to managing the insurance marketplace within their states. They need to ensure that their markets are healthy and solvent, with increased catastrophe and climate risk, and to ensure availability and affordability of insurance. It has become increasingly important for regulators to build knowledge and understanding of these CAT models. So if we think historically, the knowledge and understanding of CAT models have been limited in the regulatory community for many reasons. One simply is that these are proprietary CAT models, and model vendors have a lot of IP around these models. So the documentation or the knowledge doesn't exist in public space that is readily available for regulators. Other fact is that these are complex models, so there are not enough standard resources that exist within individual state DOIs and within NAIC around these CAT models. So in my role, I'm going to first touch on the education piece, and then I will come back to the first point around the model documentation. So within NAIC, my main role surrounds around creating educational resources and tools for these CAT models. So we have actually developed a foundational course around these CAT models that is peril agnostic. So if you guys remember the slide that Greg showed on the framework of CAT model. So despite the model vendor or the peril, the framework is similar. So the foundational course focuses on different components of that framework, the input, output, and application of CAT models. So that's what we are doing in the foundational course. Now, later we will develop this and expand this training program to specific perils. We'll go more in depth depending upon individual states' needs, because if you think about Atlantic states, they are more focused on hurricane perils, whereas the state where I live in, Colorado, the main focus is obviously wildfire and hail. So that's around like why it's also important for regulators to be knowledgeable about these CAT models and have foundational understanding. Now I'm going to come back to my first point, which is around the model documentation. So as part of setting up NAIC's CAT COE, one of our goals was to set up a repository of model documentation, like a secure repository. So we have now collaboration with various model vendors, which are 6 and 7 in space, and not just on NetCat, but also on man-made CAT, like casualty CAT models. And we have made a secure website for regulators where they can go and access this technical model documentation. So that is how we are tackling this issue. Now, some of my listeners who are on the call today on this webinar, they know that how technical, lengthy, and scientific the model documentation can be, right? So as part of our advisory services to the regulators, we are creating what we call peril model vendor insight cards. So these will be like very short 1 to 2 page documents by peril for each model vendor around high level view, which will cover like what different options or settings can be chosen by insurance companies while running these models, and what these different settings mean at a high level. So not going in very much depth, so that the regulators have an understanding by peril and by each model vendors. Now, once we establish and roll out these foundational tools and resources, our next phase will be to take to the next level. During that phase, we will focus on working with individual states or a group of states. We have 4 zones for our member states, and there are various groups within NAIC that focus on the catastrophes. So we'll be working with them in the direction of like what questions and areas should be of focus for regulators when it comes to CAT models, whether they are as part of rate review, solvency assessment, and market exams. And we have already started some work in this direction, working with different groups and providing direction to the regulators. Now, as the role of regulators is expanding with increased climate and catastrophe risk, CAT COE is also focused on applied research using these models for risk assessment, risk quantification, and mitigation. So we'll pick up this conversation at some other time in another webinar. So as you can see, that CAT models are not just important for actuaries like Greg, but also for regulators as well. So Linda, I'm sure I could go on, but I will pause to pass the conversation back to you for some final discussion points. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists for this engaging conversation. I want to end our conversation with a few questions for the entire panel, as I think each of you might have a slightly different perspective to speak to. So the first question I'd like to ask is, what states have legislation? And then, what is the NAIC doing with this data? You, Greg? Do you like to?
Well, I think it's key in Shaveta and Sandra will know more about the actual laws and regulations, but it's important for regulators to consider at a high level, not just what models are being used and how they're, but how the companies are incorporating that into their specific rate plan. So, for example, that they're appropriately taking into account loss adjustment expenses, and that whether they've considered the results of multiple models and things like that. So there are best practices surrounding not just what models you use and what output you use and the usage of models itself, but how you apply those within your rate indication to make sure that the company is not misusing the model results.
Great, thank you. Sandra, do you have a perspective?
Oh, I would agree with Greg, and I appreciate those comments because I think that's part of the learning process that we're working with Shaveta on, Greg. So thank you for highlighting that. I'd also like to say we have states like Florida, Louisiana, and they require detailed information on CAT models for rate making, and those are established by legislation. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, Florida has the Hurricane Commission that approves the CAT models for rate making. Louisiana has CAT model interrogatories that insurance companies and the CAT modelers have to fill out and complete from the rate making perspective. There are other states like Hawaii, South Carolina, where the DOIs review the models and publish a list of approved models for use. It's less comprehensive of a review than Florida or Louisiana, but it's still more thorough than what I currently do because I follow Florida. There are other states like Colorado, North Carolina, Texas, where legislation exists around the use of catastrophic models for rate making. The focus mainly on disclosing information on the model being used and the support provided by the filing company. Or they also do as Maine does and allow models to be used that are approved by Florida. So I'm not the only state out there using that.
Right. Thank you. Shaveta, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, sure. So, so we are actually working with our member states, and we are doing a CAT modeling survey around like how different states interact with these CAT models from a rate making perspective. So even though there are as Sandra mentioned, like there are many states where they have statutes and legislation. Many states, apart from what Sandra has mentioned, they don't have specific guidelines or statutes, but most allow use of CAT models. There are states like Texas, Georgia that did not allow use of CAT models in the past, but have recognized the value and importance of CAT models, considering limitation of limited historical experience. So coming to the point that what NAIC is doing with this data. So in many states, the rate filings are confidential, and before NAIC can start evaluating this information from CAT models perspective to come up with like state-specific tools to support, we need to get approval and access from individual states to access this data, which is stored in a system called SURF. So we are working with our states in this initiative, and in future we'll look to provide further insights, leveraging that state-specific data around these CAT models.
Great. Thank you. So another thing I wondered is, why would it be important to understand usage of hurricane models if your state is not regularly impacted by these typical natural disasters? And then how does the impact of climate change come into play? Sandra, you want to talk about that?
I would be glad to. As I mentioned, Maine has, a very large coastline. And so even though we're used to getting Category 1 and Category 2 hurricanes in the future with climate change, if the waters along our coastline warm, as the climate changes, we could see Category 3 or Category 4 hurricanes. So we need to make sure that the insurance companies are building in enough load in their rates, so that way they maintain solvency. That's one of the most important jobs that we have, is the adequacy of the rates that they're using. So it's very, very important to understand the hurricane models, because the future hurricanes that could come are unknown.
Great. Thank you. Greg, do you have a point of view on this?
Yeah. Even if you're in a state where hurricane exposure is obviously not an issue, regardless of climate change, like Oklahoma or South Dakota or something, the usage of models similar to hurricane models for other weather-related perils is increasing over time. And there's probably at least some major weather-related peril that has a big impact on the rates in your state. So even if hurricane models are not a concern in particular, the general header of catastrophe models is only increasing in importance within the industry. And that's across virtually all weather-related perils. So it should have some impact on pretty much every state in the U.S.
Great, thank you. And Shaveta.
Yes, Linda, I would agree with what Sandra and Greg have mentioned on, like, even if you are not a coastal state, with these increased climate and catastrophe risk, it's very important to understand. And what I say is that, like, there have been studies that how the nature of the risk can be changing, and we could, like the steering currents may shift, and they may shift the storms to a certain region where we may not have seen like a hurricane landfall in the past. So there has been scientific research, right? So it is very important to keep that in mind, that with climate risk, the nature of the peril is shifting and changing as well.
Great, thank you. So Greg, I think you kind of brought this up, that models are increasing. So what types of other models are being utilized and for what perils?
So I'd say the closest parallel to hurricane models is earthquake models. That's another model that's been around for decades that has virtually universal usage within the industry. I think virtually any insurer or reinsurer that writes earthquake insurance is using a model in some capacity. So that is probably the closest parallel, also in terms of just being a low frequency and extremely high severity exposure, and used as an important exposure management tool and reinsurance purchasing decisions. So that's probably the closest parallel, but there's lots of other models that exist out there as well. I'll highlight a few. Severe convective storm, or SCS, is a term you'll hear used a lot. That's essentially modeling tornadoes, but it's thunderstorms in general. They sometimes model hail as a risk as well, and you can see that there have been, in the last decade or two, multiple tornado or hailstorm events that have had a nearly hurricane level impact on losses, especially in Dallas, Phoenix, some big cities where there's hail exposure. There have been multiple hailstorms and tornado events that have done hundreds of millions, if not billions, of damage within the last 10 years. So it's a critical exposure that the science behind severe convective storm modeling is still developing, but the usage of those within the industry, I think, is only going to keep increasing over time. The second is voluntary flood. Now, the only reason flood models aren't used as much as earthquake and hurricane is that the voluntary flood market is comparatively really small. I think most flood insurance is still written by the NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program, which has its own rate program. But the writing of voluntary flood is increasing quite a bit, and many predict it will continue to increase. People taking risks out of the NFIP and writing it in regular insurance companies. That's what we call voluntary flood. It's insurance companies writing flood on purpose instead of the NFIP, which is forced to write everybody. And flood models and the continued development of flood models is a big part of why insurance companies are now willing to write this risk that used to be considered totally uninsurable. But as flood models continue to develop, and as catastrophe models in general continue to develop, the notion of what risks are and are not insurable is continuing to develop. And the last category of models, very critical one right now, is wildfire. Wildfire models are vastly increasing in importance in just the last few years. California is the epicenter of the wildfire risk, of course, and they have had various ways that they're attempting to deal with the wildfire risk in the state, and figuring out what is the best way for insurance companies to be able and not be able to use wildfire models is a critical component of that. But it's not just California. Just because you're not writing in California doesn't mean you don't have wildfire risk. Obviously, we see what's happening in Canada right now, but there's tons of wildfire risk in lots of other states, Colorado, Texas, all throughout that area of the U.S. The wildfire risk is very large, and many people believe global warming and other factors are resulting in major increases to wildfire risk now versus where we were at 20, 30 years ago. So if you're just using long-term average results to rate wildfire risk, you could really be missing the mark. And that's where wildfire models can come into play.
Okay,
I think those are the main ones.
Okay, great. So based on the conversation we had, how do CAT models in the future intersect with climate models? Shaveta, do you want to talk about that?
Sure, Linda. I think that's a very good and relevant question in today's market or the world we live in today. The scientific community and I would say model vendors are very diligently working on this challenging and important task. What I have been reading in literature on this topic that no one has a crystal ball to know the exact answer. There are two different views. One is that to start with totally different type of models like AI models. And then the other is that we already have CAT models to build upon CAT models by integration with climate models. And there's a lot of work going on, and actually a lot of model vendors for perils like hurricane, flood, wildfire, they have climate condition catalogs. It's like a adjusted hazard view based upon the future climate condition. And when I'm saying future, it means like many years from now, 2050 or 2030, in that time horizon. What I would say is that, so there's a lot of literature, a lot of things that have sprouted in this space. What I would say is that whatever the right answer might be, it's very important to not to look at the problem in isolation, and we need to recognize and communicate the uncertainties and biases in this methodology and the models chosen, right? Because CAT models, they like CAT risk in itself is volatile in nature and very hard to estimate and predict, right? And when you add on top of climate model, they have their own inherent uncertainties and biases. So we just have to be careful around when we are looking at these tools and methodologies. So that's what I would say.
Great. Thank you. Unless anyone else has anything else, one of my favorite questions to ask based on your knowledge and our topic today, what keeps you up at night regarding this topic? And Shaveta, you were on a good roll. Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I would start with, what keeps me at night. What keeps me at night is like, where the next big event would happen and how it would impact the market in terms of availability and affordability of insurance. And we are hearing a lot of things in that space these days. So it's the thing that keeps me up at night, right? So we live in a very different world today. There is so much talk about increasing frequency and severity of these CAT events due to increased climate risk and also more exposures in disaster-prone areas due to demographic shifts that have happened in past decade or so. So that's the problem that that keeps me up at night. So we need to look at the problem from a slightly different lens, because my view is that this cannot be solved solely through insurance. We need some kind of public-private partnership. And I think the education for the consumer and awareness from a consumer perspective is also equally important. And I would add to that is that the right incentive and funding for risk mitigation when we are building in such disaster-prone areas. So that's also important as well.
Great, thank you. Sandra, would you like to talk about what keeps you up at night?
Thanks, Linda. I would have to 100% agree with Shaveta. Availability and affordability of insurance keeps me up at night, but as well as making sure the companies are solvent. So, I think it's a fine line in regulation when you're, reviewing something like a cat load in a rate filing and worrying about the affordability of insurance for the consumers, as well as making sure that the insurance company has the rate that they need to provide that coverage to the insurers. So I think, climate change, the possibility of the ocean warming on our coastline, those keep me up at night. The models themselves, like Greg said, are complicated. They're doing the best that they can. They've been, especially hurricane models, they've been around a long time. They're doing the best that they can. They're constantly being refined. But yeah, definitely the affordability and the availability of insurance for the Maine consumers does make me worry as climate changes and these events become more severe.
Yeah, thank you. And Greg, your thoughts?
Yeah, my biggest concern as it relates to catastrophe models is making sure that the uncertainty and difficulty in projecting this exposure is properly being taken into account by everybody, from insurance companies to regulators to consumers, all up and down. It's easy when you see how complicated catastrophe models are. When you get a list from a CAT modeler about all the people who developed the model, they'll send you a list of dozens of PhDs in engineering and meteorology, and it's a very impressive list. And it's just, wow, a lot of smart people built this model, so it's probably right. And I think that it's important to recognize that we found that hurricane models have been a really useful tool. They've really been helpful in the industry, but they are a projection. They're a very unreliable projection. They are the best that we can do. They're the best information that we have given the state of current research. But there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding this exposure, even with the best possible information we can see, even much less for hypothetical storms, tracking the path of those. It's extremely difficult for meteorologists even to predict the path of real storms that already exist and they've already got all the data for, and you see how much those projections move over time. And it's not a criticism of meteorologists, it's just a recognition of the reality of how little we know about a lot of this information. Now, I do think the industry has started to understand some of the limitations of catastrophe models and some of the uncertainties and risks that they don't quite capture, with some recent storms like Hurricane Irma in 2017 and Hurricane Laura in 2020, that for various reasons both had losses that were projected, that were at much higher than the CAT model would have projected. And I don't know that there's a great, that this is part of the reason why it's concerning to me. I don't know that there is a great way to adjust for things or take them into account, but it's just important when you're looking at CAT model data that you have a healthy skepticism, particularly given then that's the number one reason why it's so critical, if it's a major component of what you're doing, to try as hard as you can to get multiple CAT modelers and consider the results of multiple models, because everybody has a different perspective, a different way they look at things, and different models can produce very different results for the same book of business, even for the same storm, even ignoring the meteorological component after the fact, post-event modeling, they call it. That's projecting what the ultimate losses an insurer will have after an event has already occurred. Like for Hurricane Ian, the meteorological component doesn't matter. We know what the wind field was for that storm, but even then, there's a massive difference in what different modelers would say one insurance company would be the ultimate losses from that storm. And again, it's not a criticism of CAT models, it's just taking into account the difficulty in projecting these issues.
Great. Well, thank you to our panelists for their engaging conversation this afternoon. We now have a few minutes left for Q&A, so please use the Q&A submission box function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit any questions you may have for our panelists today. And please note that if we don't have time for all submitted questions, we'll be sure to reach out directly to answer them after today's session. So let's start with the first question. And Sandra, it looks like it's directed to you. And the question is, do you look at CAT modeling differently for commercial insurance versus personal insurance? In Maine, there can be significant exposure from northeasters in the winter to tropical storms in the summer, which can be as costly of damage as a hurricane.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you for that question. I would say that I would look at it the same. So in the sense that my review would be the same. I would expect that winter storm would be modeled out as well as hurricane here in Maine, because winter storms definitely, I mean, we can think back to the ice storm of 1998 and understand how much losses happened during that time when we were shut down for that period of time. So I expect, a hurricane load as well as a winter storm load to be included in the rates. So I would review them both. The problem that comes up there is that, the Florida Commission doesn't usually review winter storm models. So it's something I have to spend a little more time on. But yeah, I definitely do. My review is very similar. And, as I said, I'm still learning, all about the different models that are available. And, I hope to, utilize Shaveta's team at the NAIC for these different types of models.
Great. Thank you. The next question, what are good estimates for multiple of AAL for lower versus larger standard deviation for pricing individual policies? Does that?
The question does make sense, but I don't know that it's really possible to answer it. What the standard deviation is relative to the AAL, that will impact what the PMLs are and just the uncertainty of the losses. It just completely depends on where you're writing, what your book of business is, how many homes you write close to the coast, how close the homes you write together are. If you write every home on a street versus you have a really solid catastrophe management plan and you only write homes that are far apart. I mean, it's not really a question that's answerable. There is not a good estimate or rule of thumb for that, unfortunately.
Okay. And last question, are these models generalized for every requirement that occurs? Whoops. Let's see here. Or are they, let's see here. Or are they tweaked a bit based on the requirements? So let me read that again. Are these models generalized for every requirement that occurs, or are the models tweaked a bit based on the requirements? Does that make sense?
My interpretation of, I'll answer based on my interpretation of the question. I think that some states, and this speaks back to something Sandra was saying earlier, it's important to keep in mind. Some states will have very specific requirements about what switches and what version of the model you are allowed to use. So for Florida, for example, if you go to any major modeler and you ask them, they will tell you this is the exact version. In fact, they'll often just have a drop-down box, Florida OIR version, and that will get all the switches exactly the way that Florida requires. So the reason why that's important to consider is if you're looking at a model and you're saying, in my state, it's okay for them to use this model because Florida has approved it. It's just, I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do, but it is worth pointing out that Florida is only approving one specific version of the model with a specific exact set of switches flipped. For example, Florida does not allow uses of short-term models. So they are not at all reviewing the way that a modeler takes into account short-term versus long-term frequencies. And there's lots of other examples as well. So there are general versions of the models that will allow you to flip switches and use things however you want to match a specific state's regulation. If it's a major state like Florida or Louisiana or like California for earthquake, probably the modelers will know and be able to tell you this is the exact version of the model the state wants you to use. I know Shaveta might have some thoughts on that as well.
No, I think, Greg, you mentioned it correctly, that like certain states have different, like very specific requirements. Other states, they don't have specific requirements, but they still need the company to disclose the information that what's the model version being used, what are the model settings being used. So it depends upon state to state as well.
Great.
And may
Well-
I add one thing, Linda?
Of
And I
course.
would add, on Greg's point, that's one of the things that, as a regulator, we're hoping to learn from Shaveta's team is when to say this switch is not correct. And so the idea of asking for the model version and the switches that the company is using in the rate filing is to kind of get that information out from the modelers, so that way we can review correctly.
Great. Well, Greg, Sandra, Shaveta, good discussion. It looks like this is all the time we have today. We want to thank you all for attending the AAIS webinar. And if you missed any of the discussion, you'll be able to watch a replay from our on-demand library on the AAIS YouTube channel in the coming weeks. And we'll also send a follow-up email with all panelists' contact information, as well as a link to the video recording. And, one thing from today, hurricane and cat models are an ever-changing, ever-evolving topic. So if you have a suggestion for future webinar or more on a part of this discussion, please let us know. And also, please feel free to contact one of the AAIS engagement managers with any questions, or if you would like an introduction to the AAIS partner, Davies. So with that being said, please enjoy the rest of your afternoon.